Welcome to our lecture on inflation. Now, inflation, like the last video on employment, is kind of a representation of a broad spectrum of economic indicators. Basically, inflation has anything to do with prices. So, like I said, inflation has to do something with prices, right? And inflation is simply an increase in the average price level. And it's not a change in any specific price. It's a change in the average price level. So in other words, what you're doing is you're monitoring or watching many different prices. And you're looking at how does the average price level change. So anything with a price has a representative inflation rate. For example, um, foods, clothing, uh, energy prices, all of these things have prices associated with it. So there's an inflation rate associated with it. But other things too, like assets, stocks have prices. So when you hear about the stock market going up, that's really represents an increase in the inflation rate for stocks. So when home prices go up, that's also an inflation rate. So the average increase in prices, the increase is inflation. Now, over the history of man, prices have gone up, they've gone down, and there have been some instances where the prices have gone up rapidly. And one example would be in post-World War I Germany in 1923. Prices rose 1 trillion times over. Think about that for a second. Um, when the inflation rate goes above 5% a year in the United States, that's considered to be a rapid increase in inflation. In Germany, it rose 1 trillion times over. Prices in Russia, Bulgaria, or some other nations that have also witnessed a tenfold increase in inflation in 1 year. In the 1990s, the U.S. inflation rate, by contrast, rose on an annual basis only between 1 to 4% a year. Now, here's an example of how bad it got in Germany between just May and June. So we're talking about a 2-month increase in 1923. Consumer prices quadrupled in just 2 months. So question, how bad did inflation get in Germany in 1923 alone? Well, prices were rising so rapidly, workers had to be paid 2 to 3 times a day so they could buy goods in the morning before prices increased in the afternoon. That's how bad things were getting. Throughout that year, inflation continued to skyrocket, and by November, just a loaf of bread in Germany cost 140 billion marks. And here's a nice little graphic that shows you. So this shows the dollar to mark exchange rate. So in 1919, $1 bought you roughly 68 marks. So that was the exchange rate. And you could see by 1923, $1 bought you 4.2 trillion marks. So that goes to show you that inflation causes the purchasing power of money to diminish. So the faster inflation goes up, the more the value of money goes down. And here's some examples of what we call hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is an increase in the inflation rate by 200% or more a year. So if you experience inflation rate above 200% a year, it's considered to be hyperinflation. And you could see the history's most dramatic example of hyperinflation is Hungary in August 1945. So right at the end of World War II, it went up by 10 to the 16th. So that's a 1 with 16 zeros after it. And you can see here Germany is 4th, but another modern day equivalent is Zimbabwe. that experienced 10 to the 10th. So that's a 1 with 10 zeros after it. So although inflation is regarded as a major macroeconomic problem in the United States, American inflation is relatively low and stable. So the average price is determined by finding the average price of all output. And so the rise in the average price is called inflation. And what if the average prices actually fall? We call that deflation. So when average prices go up, inflation. When average prices go down or decrease, deflation. Now, let me tell you about another term that you may hear in the news that may confuse you. It's called disinflation. So I'm going to contrast deflation with disinflation. Inflation indicators are occasionally misinterpreted by the public and badly reported by the media. One common mistake is the failure to distinguish between deflation and disinflation. For example, let's read a mock headline and let's try to interpret what it means. So here's the mock headline. The inflation rate, as measured by CPI, that's Consumer Price Index, fell to a 2.3% month-to-month annualized rate in April from 3.3% in March. So just take a look at that quote once again. So the question is, did the economy experience inflation, deflation, or disinflation for the month of April? The answer is it experienced disinflation from March to April because the economy saw the average price increase, but it just increased at a slower rate. So disinflation is simply the slowing of inflation. So if the inflation rate goes from 4% one month and then the inflation rate goes to 3% the next month, prices are still increasing. It's just increasing at a slower rate. So that's disinflation. And so what we're going to be doing in the next video, we're going to be talking about how to distinguish between inflation, deflation, and disinflation.